The capture. It was an ordinary day on Earth when the girl, Alina, found herself in the middle of something she could never have prepared for. A typical young woman, living in a small town, she had no idea that her life was about to be turned upside down in the most unimaginable way. She was walking home from work, her thoughts drifting between the mundane tasks of daily life, when everything around her suddenly shifted. A strange noise filled the air. It was unlike anything she had ever heard before, low, deep, and pulsing, as if the sky itself was trembling. Alina paused, looking up, her heart beginning to race. She squinted against the afternoon sun, trying to make sense of the strange feeling in the pit of her stomach. Then, before she could fully comprehend what was happening, the world around her went dark. The ground beneath her feet vanished, and she was lifted into the air with an unimaginable force. Her screams were swallowed by the deafening sound of rushing wind. Alina struggled, but the grip on her was unyielding. She couldn't see what had taken hold of her, but she could feel it, cold, metallic, and powerful. Panic surged through her as she tried to scream for help, but no words escaped. It was as if the very air around her had been stolen. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Alina's world was spinning. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. Her body slammed against something hard, and she felt a sharp pain in her back. She gasped for air, finally able to breathe again. But the cold, sterile atmosphere of her new surroundings made it feel unnatural. She was inside something massive. When she opened her eyes, she saw nothing but cold, metal walls around her. Her hands trembled, and her heart pounded in her chest as the full reality of the situation hit her. She wasn't on Earth anymore. She was somewhere else, somewhere unknown. Alina tried to move, but her body felt heavy and sluggish, as if every part of her was fighting against her. She could hear the low hum of machinery, a distant whirring that felt both eerie and mechanical. The air smelled different, sterile, almost clinical, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. She wasn't alone. A shadow crossed the room, and Alina's heart skipped a beat. A tall figure emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing in the dim light. The alien was like nothing she had ever seen before. Its skin was smooth and grayish, its features sharp and angular, its eyes glowing with an unsettling light. It stood still for a moment, studying her with a gaze that felt both curious and calculating. Without a word, the alien extended a long arm toward her. Alina flinched, but her body refused to obey. It was as if every muscle had gone numb. She could only watch, helpless, as the alien's fingers gently touched her forehead. A strange sensation washed over her, cold, like ice flowing through her veins. Then, the world around her seemed to tilt once again, as though the very laws of gravity were being twisted. Alina's vision blurred. She couldn't focus, couldn't think straight. Her mind felt foggy, as though she was sinking into a deep sleep, unable to escape. The alien's face remained impassive, but its eyes held something deeper, a coldness that made her feel small and insignificant, like nothing more than a specimen to be examined. The alien pulled its hand away, and with a simple gesture, a small door opened in the wall behind it. Two more aliens appeared, their movements swift and precise. They were identical in appearance, with their smooth skin and glowing eyes. They moved with mechanical precision, their eyes never leaving Alina's trembling form. Alina was roughly pulled to her feet, and before she could fully comprehend what was happening, she was dragged down a long, sterile hallway. The walls seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, the lights above flickering intermittently. Alina tried to resist, but her strength was no match for the alien's grip. They were stronger, faster, and far more advanced than anything she had ever imagined. They moved in silence, their footsteps echoing in the quiet corridors. Alina's mind raced. Where were they taking her? Why was she here? She tried to form a plan, a way to escape, but the reality of her situation set in. She was alone. She was powerless. The journey felt like an eternity. Every step seemed to take her further away from everything she knew. Her mind kept returning to Earth, the warmth of the sun, the familiar sounds of the city, her life that now felt like a distant memory. She didn't know where she was or why she had been taken, but one thing was clear. She had been chosen for something. The aliens didn't speak, but Alina could feel their presence as they guided her to a large, cold chamber. It was empty, save for a single chair in the center. She was forced into the chair, her limbs strapped down with cold, metallic restraints. A hum filled the room as the alien soldiers stepped back, their glowing eyes watching her with cold, calculating stares. Alina tried to speak, but no words came. She couldn't even move. Fear surged through her as she realized that this was only the beginning. She had no idea what these aliens wanted with her, but she knew one thing for certain. Her life as she knew it was over. What they had planned for her, she could only imagine. But one thing was clear. She wasn't going to go down without a fight. Alina's heart was pounding in her chest, the cold metal restraints digging into her wrists and ankles. She had no idea how long she had been in this strange chamber, but it felt like an eternity. The air was cold, sterile, and oppressive, with the faint hum of machines running in the background. It was as if she were in some kind of twisted laboratory, far from Earth, far from anything she could recognize. The silence in the room was deafening, but it didn't last long. The door on the far side of the chamber slid open, and in walked one of the aliens, the one she had first seen when she was captured. It didn't speak, but its eyes studied her with an unnerving calmness. The alien stepped closer, its tall, skeletal figure moving with eerie precision. Its glowing eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, Alina thought she could see something in those eyes, something cold, calculating. Then, without warning, it raised its hand. Alina's breath hitched as she realized what was coming. A sharp electric pulse shot through her body, and a jolt of pain coursed through her veins. She screamed, her voice echoing through the chamber, but the sound was muffled by the overwhelming hum of the machines around her. The alien watched her closely, its expression unchanged as it pressed a device into her side. The pain intensified, like 1,000 needles pricking at her skin, spreading across her body. She twisted and turned in the chair, desperate to escape, but the restraints held her firmly in place. Her body was betraying her muscles trembling with the shock and pain that coursed through her. It wasn't just the physical pain that overwhelmed her. It was the helplessness, the fact that she had no control over her own body. She could feel her mind slipping, each shock driving her further into a haze. Her thoughts became clouded, her vision blurry, and her body felt as though it were being torn apart. The alien stepped back, watching her suffering with cold detachment. It seemed to take pleasure in her pain, in the way she squirmed and screamed, unable to break free. Alina couldn't understand why this was happening to her. Why her? What had she done to deserve this? Her thoughts were interrupted when the alien reached for another device. This one looked even more menacing, its dark, jagged edges shimmering in the dim light of the chamber. Alina's stomach dropped. She had a sinking feeling that things were about to get much worse. Without a word, the alien pressed the device to her arm. A sharp, stabbing sensation spread through her as the device pierced her skin, injecting something into her veins. The pain was unbearable, and Alina's body jerked involuntarily as the foreign substance began to spread through her. It felt like fire, like molten lava coursing through her bloodstream. She tried to scream, but her throat was raw, and the sound was nothing more than a choked gasp. The alien observed her carefully, its eyes glowing as it watched her reaction. Alina felt her heart racing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She couldn't focus, couldn't think straight. The pain was overwhelming, and her vision was starting to fade. The edges of her consciousness blurred as if she were slipping into darkness. But just as she thought she might lose herself entirely, the alien withdrew. The pain didn't stop. It kept gnawing at her, pulling her down into a place where nothing made sense. Her mind was fractured, her thoughts scattered and fragmented. She couldn't even make sense of what was happening to her. She had never felt so small, so insignificant. The alien didn't need to speak to communicate its power. It was in the way it moved, the way it controlled everything around her. Belina was nothing but an object to be toyed with, a test subject in some cruel experiment. Her existence didn't matter, not to these beings. But in that moment, something stirred within her. A tiny spark of defiance, hidden deep within the pit of her heart. Elena had no idea how she would survive this, how she would escape. But she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to give up. She wasn't going to break so easily. She would endure whatever they threw at her. She had to. The alien left the room without a word, its heavy footsteps echoing in the chamber. Elena was left alone in the darkness, her body trembling from the effects of the torture. But even as her body felt weak, her mind began to clear, even if just a little. She couldn't give in to the pain. She couldn't let them win. She had to stay strong. For herself, for her planet, because somewhere deep down, she knew that this was only the beginning. The aliens would return, and when they did, Elena would be ready. Her eyes fluttered, her breathing slow but steady, and a thought entered her mind, one that had been buried deep within her throughout the pain. I will survive this. Time was no longer something Elena could track. It was impossible to tell how long she had been in the alien facility, whether it had been hours, days, or weeks. The only thing she knew for sure was that her body felt like it was being constantly pushed to its limits. Every inch of her skin burned from the aliens' torturous experiments. Her breathing was shallow and labored, each breath feeling like a struggle. The pain never ceased, lingering in her muscles, bones, and organs like a constant reminder of her helplessness. Yet, amidst the agony, there was a strange determination growing inside her. Something inside her refused to die. She had been through unimaginable suffering, but she hadn't given up. And that was when something strange began to happen. The quiet hum of the chamber's machines, machines that had been present in every torturous moment, began to grow louder, more noticeable. The energy in the room seemed to shift. Then, as if something had triggered it, the door to the chamber opened with a soft hiss, and a figure stepped inside. Elena's heart skipped a beat as she saw the alien. This one was different. Larger than the others, its skin shimmering with an eerie light, it moved with an air of authority. Elena immediately realized this wasn't just any alien. This was the leader, the one who had been behind her torment. She could see the flicker of recognition in its eyes as it looked at her, its expression unreadable. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the silence stretching long between them. Elena's body felt weak, but she refused to let it show. There was a quiet strength in her now, a resolve that hadn't been there before. It was as if the pain had awakened something deep within her. The alien stepped closer, examining her closely. Elena's heart raced, and though her body trembled, she clenched her fists. She wasn't going to show fear, not anymore. The alien's eyes narrowed slightly, perhaps sensing her defiance. It raised one long, skeletal arm and pointed directly at her. Elena braced herself, expecting more pain, more torture. But to her surprise, it did nothing. It simply stood there, studying her as if calculating something in its mind. Suddenly, it spoke in a language she couldn't understand. Its voice was harsh, cold, and mechanical, like the sound of metal scraping against stone. Elena could only guess at what it said, but she understood the tone. It was mocking. This alien, this leader, seemed to be toying with her. As it continued to speak in its alien tongue, Elena tried to focus, straining to make sense of its words. Despite the pain, despite the exhaustion weighing her down, something inside her clicked. She didn't know how, but she understood. There was something about its tone that resonated with her. It was arrogance, absolute arrogance. The belief that this creature had already won, that it had already broken her. A surge of anger coursed through Elena. The realization hit her hard. They think they've won, but they were wrong. In a burst of unexpected strength, Elena lifted her head, meeting the alien's eyes with a fire she hadn't known she still had. She was done being passive, done being a victim. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about fighting back. She wasn't going to let these aliens break her. She wasn't going to let them think they could do whatever they wanted with her, or anyone else. The alien leader tilted its head, almost as if it were intrigued by her sudden change in demeanor. Alina clenched her jaw and summoned every ounce of strength she had left. With what little energy she had, she forced herself to speak, her voice rough and weak but filled with purpose. "You think you can break me?" she rasped, her words coming out hoarsely. The alien stopped, its glowing eyes studying her more intently now. Alina could feel the weight of its gaze. For a brief moment, there was silence again, as though the world had stopped to listen. The alien made no move to strike her, its silence hanging in the air like a threat. But Alina was no longer afraid. The rage she felt had extinguished her fear. She had lost so much already. Her fear was no longer a weapon they could use against her. The alien leader's lips twisted in what might have been a smile, though it was unsettling. Alina couldn't help but wonder if it had anticipated her defiance. In the briefest moment, its expression shifted, as if considering the unexpected turn of events. Then, the door to the chamber slid open once again, and the familiar sound of the other alien's footsteps echoed in the hallway. The leader paused for a moment, glancing back at the door, and then returned its gaze to Alina. There was a glimmer of something, an understanding, or perhaps something more dangerous, something darker. Before it could make a move, the lights in the chamber flickered. The soft hum of the machines sputtered as if they were malfunctioning, and for a brief moment, Alina was left in the darkness. In that moment, everything changed. A surge of energy swept through her, as though her body had been recharged with new strength. For a split second, the room felt alive with a new force, a new possibility. Alina didn't know where it came from, but she could feel it. Something within her had changed. The alien leader stepped back, a flicker of surprise crossing its face. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for. Alina didn't waste a second. As the alien's focus wavered for that brief moment, she twisted in her restraints with all her might. The metal holding her cracked. The chains that once bound her arms and legs gave way. The alien leader seemed caught off guard, but Alina didn't give it the time to react. With a quick, desperate move, she broke free. Now, in the darkness, Alina knew the real fight had just begun. She wasn't their prisoner anymore. She wasn't broken. She was a force to be reckoned with. The moment Alina broke free from her restraints, time seemed to slow. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but the adrenaline pumping through her veins drowned out the pain. The weight of her chains was no longer a concern. She was free. The alien leader's surprise was palpable, and for just a split second, it hesitated. Alina didn't give it the time to recover. Without thinking, she sprang toward the door, her legs still weak from the tortures she'd endured, but her mind was focused on freedom. The darkened corridor outside beckoned, and with it, the possibility of escape. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts as she sprinted down the hallway. The alien facility was vast, with endless metal walls and silent, cold floors. Yet, for the first time since her capture, Alina felt something she hadn't thought possible: hope. Her pulse raced as she turned a corner, her heart hammering against her chest. But as she rounded the corner, Alina collided with something solid, a force that knocked her backward into the cold, hard ground. She gasped, her hands instinctively reaching for the pain that shot through her skull. Looking up, she saw the shadow of an alien soldier standing over her, its cold eyes unblinking as it regarded her. The same soldiers who had been part of her suffering. The same ones who had laughed as they tortured her. "Get up," the alien hissed, its voice deep and threatening, causing Alina's stomach to drop. But Alina wasn't afraid anymore. Her body might have been weak, but her spirit was stronger than ever. Without warning, she pushed herself up from the floor and lunged forward, her fists swinging toward the alien's head. It wasn't the most graceful attack, but it was fueled by pure defiance. The soldier stumbled back, taken aback by her sudden attack. Alina seized the opportunity. She twisted around, grabbing the alien's weapon, a long, thin blade, before it could react. The alien hissed in anger, but she didn't give it a chance to retaliate. Alina swung the weapon, and the alien soldier dodged with an agility that seemed impossible for something its size. But Alina was quick, and with one well-placed strike, the soldier stumbled, falling to the floor with a loud thud. Alina didn't waste a second. She was back on her feet and running again, not looking back. Her mind was consumed with one thought: escape. The taste of freedom had ignited something deep within her, something that no alien force could extinguish. As she sprinted down the dark corridor, she could hear the faint hum of machinery, the distant voices of more aliens, somewhere far down the hall. She didn't have much time before they realized she was gone. She rounded another corner and stopped dead in her tracks. Ahead of her was a vast chamber, its entrance guarded by several more alien soldiers. The sound of their alien language filled the air, their voices harsh and guttural. Alina's heart skipped a beat. She was trapped. For a moment, she considered turning back, finding another way. But there was no other way. If she stayed hidden, the aliens would eventually find her. The only chance she had was to fight her way through. She took a deep breath, calming her nerves. With the alien weapon still gripped in her hands, Alina gathered every ounce of strength and courage. It's now or never. Without another moment's hesitation, she dashed forward, heading straight toward the group of soldiers. The aliens immediately noticed her and raised their weapons, their eyes narrowing as they prepared to fire. Alina didn't hesitate. She leaped, using the walls to propel herself upward and over their heads, narrowly dodging their attacks. She heard their weapons fire, but she didn't stop. As she landed on the other side of the group, Alina spun around and struck the closest alien with the blade, the sharp edge cutting through its armor and into its chest. The alien let out a strangled scream before collapsing to the floor. But there was no time to savor the victory. More soldiers were moving in, their weapons aimed at her. Alina's heart raced, but she didn't falter. She ducked, rolled, and quickly found cover behind a series of metallic crates. The aliens weren't just after her. They were hunting her down with an intensity she had never felt before. She could hear their footsteps, feel their presence as they surrounded her. But there was something else she could sense in the air, something shifting. The leader, she thought. They were closing in because of the leader, the alien that had tortured her, the one who had underestimated her. But Alina knew one thing for sure now. She wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. She was fighting to make them realize their mistake. She wasn't a defenseless human anymore. She was a force they could never understand. Alina took a deep breath and stood tall behind the cover, her mind racing as she calculated her next move. The aliens would be expecting her to be terrified, to be weak. But they were wrong. She had already faced their worst, and she wasn't backing down now. The Great Escape wasn't just about finding freedom. It was about fighting back with everything she had. And this time, she was going to make sure the aliens never underestimated Earth again. In this moment, Alina was not just fighting for her life. She was fighting for humanity's survival. Alina's breath came in ragged gasps as she crouched behind the metallic crates, clutching the alien blade in her hand. Her heart raced, but it wasn't fear that fueled her now. It was pure determination. The sound of the alien soldiers closing in on her position made her pulse quicken, but she remained still, trying to steady her breath. Every second mattered. Her mind raced, trying to figure out the best way out of this. The soldiers were advancing, their voices speaking in harsh, guttural tones. Alina could hear their heavy footsteps drawing nearer, and she knew that if she didn't act fast, she would be cornered. The thought of being captured again made her stomach churn, but she refused to let it control her. She had already fought too hard to give up now. The soldiers weren't just moving in. They were hunting her with a precision that spoke of their training. Alina could feel the weight of their weapons aimed at her, even though she couldn't see them directly. She had to make a decision quickly, stay hidden or confront them head-on. Her instincts told her to wait, to bide her time and let them make the first move. The alien soldiers were predictable. They'd expect her to run or cower, but Alina had learned that the element of surprise was her best weapon. If she could catch them off guard, she might have a chance. Her fingers tightened around the alien blade, its cold surface pressing against her palm. She could hear the soldiers' footsteps slowing down, their bodies shifting in preparation. They were waiting for her to make the first move, but Alina wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. The moment came. The first soldier rounded the corner of the crate, his face a twisted mask of alien determination. His weapon was raised, and for a split second, Alina saw his eyes widen in surprise as he caught sight of her. She wasn't where he expected her to be. He hesitated, just long enough for Alina to take her chance. In a fluid motion, she leaped from her hiding spot, using the momentum to drive the blade forward. The soldier barely had time to react before the weapon sank deep into his side, his body crumpling to the floor with a deafening thud. The alien let out a strangled gasp, his hands clutching at the wound, but it was too late. He collapsed in a heap. Alina didn't stop to check if he was dead. She had no time for that. Before the others could react, she spun around and bolted, sprinting down the corridor with all the strength she could muster. Her heart thudded in her chest, each beat pushing her forward. She could hear the soldiers' footsteps pounding behind her, but she wasn't going to let them catch her. Not now. She darted around corners, taking sharp turns as she desperately searched for an exit. Her legs burned from the effort, but her resolve only grew stronger with every step. The path ahead was uncertain, but Alina was determined to find a way out of this hell. The ship's walls seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and turning in a maze she had yet to fully understand. But she couldn't stop now. She couldn't let them win. Alina's mind raced as she tried to stay one step ahead. There had to be a way out. Somewhere on this ship, there had to be a way to escape. The question was, could she find it before the aliens trapped her again? Her body was pushing beyond its limits, but she couldn't afford to slow down. She glanced over her shoulder and saw several more soldiers rounding the corner. They were gaining on her fast. Panic surged in her chest, but she quickly suppressed it. She had faced worse. She'd been tortured, captured, and nearly killed. This was nothing compared to what she had already endured. She pushed herself harder, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She needed to think, to find a way out of this. And then, as if by some miracle, she spotted a door. It wasn't a large one, barely big enough for her to squeeze through, but it was a chance, a fleeting opportunity. Without hesitating, Alina made a sharp turn and sprinted toward the door. The soldiers were closing in, their weapons raised, but she reached the door just in time, slamming her body against it with everything she had. The door swung open and she plunged into the unknown. On the other side, the world was completely different. She had no idea where this new corridor led, but she didn't care. It was her only shot. The door slammed shut behind her with a loud clang, and for a moment, Alina stood there, gasping for air, listening to the muffled sounds of the soldiers on the other side. She was momentarily safe. But she couldn't stay here. They would be back for her, and she needed to find a way to escape for good. Alina glanced down at the alien weapon still gripped in her hand. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. With renewed determination, she moved forward, deeper into the unknown. Her heart beat in rhythm with her steps, each one carrying her further away from the nightmare she'd lived through. And though she didn't know what awaited her, she knew one thing. She would fight until her last breath, no matter the odds. Alina pressed on through the unfamiliar corridor, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. The ship was vast, its metal walls stretching in every direction. She had no idea where she was or where she was headed, but it didn't matter. Every step away from the soldiers, every second of freedom, was worth it. She was fighting for her survival, no matter what it took. Her legs ached from the sprint, and her breaths were shallow, but Alina didn't allow herself to stop. The sound of her footsteps echoed off the metallic walls, a constant reminder that she wasn't alone on this ship, but there was no turning back. The only option now was to move forward. As she rounded another corner, she froze. Ahead of her was a small group of aliens, their faces twisted in disgust and malice. They hadn't noticed her yet, but it wouldn't be long before they did. Alina's heart skipped a beat, and she quickly flattened herself against the wall, praying they wouldn't see her. She held her breath, waiting for the aliens to pass. Seconds felt like hours as the soldiers shuffled closer, their alien weapons in hand. Alina could hear their hushed voices, their language strange and incomprehensible, but it was clear they were on the hunt for her. Her pulse raced in her ears, drowning out everything else. She needed to stay hidden. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the soldiers turned down another passageway, disappearing from sight. Alina released the breath she had been holding, her chest tightening in relief. But she knew it wasn't over yet. There were still many more of them, and she couldn't let her guard down. She waited a few moments to make sure the coast was clear before slowly emerging from her hiding spot. The corridor before her was dark, and the lights flickered sporadically, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Alina's grip on the alien weapon tightened. She couldn't let herself get distracted. There was still hope for escape. As she moved further down the hallway, something caught her eye. A faint glow coming from a door on the left. It was unlike anything she had seen so far on this ship. The door was slightly ajar, a small crack of light spilling through the gap. Curiosity urged her forward, and with no better plan, she carefully approached it. Pushing the door open just enough to slip through, Alina stepped into the room. To her surprise, it was quiet and unoccupied. The air was still, and the only sound was the soft hum of the ship's engines. She quickly closed the door behind her and looked around. The room was unlike anything else she had seen aboard the ship. There were no weapons, no machinery, just rows of strange containers, some of which glowed with a soft, pulsating light. But what caught her attention the most was the strange, glowing panel on the far wall. It looked like some kind of control center, a place where the ship's systems might be monitored. Alina approached it cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. There was a faint hope building inside her, a hope that this might be the key to escaping the nightmare that had become her life. She examined the panel carefully, her fingers brushing over the strange symbols and buttons. Though she couldn't understand their meaning, she knew enough about technology to recognize that this might be her chance. She pressed a series of buttons, and to her surprise, the screen lit up with information, maps of the ship, schematics, even a countdown timer that seemed to be ticking down. The countdown was ominous, and Alina felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Whatever it was connected to her escape. She couldn't waste any more time. Her hand hovered over the control panel, ready to make her next move. Suddenly, the door to the room slammed open, and Alina spun around, heart in her throat. 3 alien soldiers stood in the doorway, their eyes locking onto hers. The moment of surprise was gone. The hunt was back on. Without thinking, Alina lunged toward the control panel, hitting several more buttons in a frantic attempt to gain control of the ship. The soldiers shouted something in their strange language, but it was too late. A loud mechanical whirring noise filled the room, followed by the sound of the entire ship shifting. The soldiers froze, momentarily confused. Alina took advantage of their hesitation. With one final push, she hit a button that caused the ship's lights to flicker and the floor to shake beneath her feet. The ship was responding to her actions. She had triggered something, but what? As the soldiers advanced, Alina turned and bolted toward the door, her mind racing. She didn't know what she had done, but she was certain that it was important. She had just given herself a chance, a glimmer of hope. The soldiers growled, chasing after her, but Alina's mind was already a step ahead. She darted through the corridors, faster than before, and for the first time since her capture, she felt something she hadn't in what felt like forever. Hope. The ship was responding to her actions. She had gained control, even if just for a moment. Alina didn't know what awaited her next, but she was no longer running in blind fear. She was fighting with purpose, with determination. And this time, she wasn't going to stop until she was free. No matter the odds, she would fight her way out or die trying. With the sound of the alien soldiers behind her growing louder, Alina pressed on, refusing to look back. She had taken control of her fate, and there was no turning back now. Alina's breaths came in ragged gasps as she sprinted down the unfamiliar corridors. The alien soldiers were relentless, their footsteps echoing in pursuit, but she refused to stop. Each turn, each bend in the ship's twisting hallways, felt like a test of her endurance, but through the panic, something inside her stirred. A powerful, burning resolve to survive. She would make it out of here. She had to. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter for a moment, and Alina risked a glance behind her. She had gained some distance, but she wasn't fooled. The soldiers weren't far behind. She was running out of time and options. Her eyes scanned the hallway in front of her, and then, as if fate had intervened, she saw it. A door, half hidden behind a stack of crates, its dull metal surface barely visible in the dim light. The door was marked with strange symbols she didn't understand, but it was a chance, a doorway to something beyond the endless pursuit. Without hesitation, Alina rushed toward it, pushing the crates aside with all her strength. Her heart raced with anticipation. She had no idea what lay beyond that door, but it had to be better than the uncertain path she had been following. She reached for the handle, but before her fingers could make contact, she froze. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, too close. The soldiers had caught up. A sense of cold dread gripped her chest, but she refused to panic. Not now. Not when she was so close. She threw herself against the door, praying it would open. To her surprise, it did. The door creaked as it slid open, revealing a dark room that seemed to pulse with a strange energy. It was empty, silent, save for the hum of the ship's engines. There was something unsettling about the room, but it was her only chance. Alina stepped inside, her body tense, her senses on high alert. The door slid shut behind her with a heavy thud, and for a moment there was no sound, no footsteps, no soldiers. She had made it, or so she thought. Alina exhaled sharply, her legs trembling from the adrenaline. She had no idea what kind of room this was, but it didn't matter. She needed to regroup. She needed to think. The strange symbols on the walls caught her attention once again. They seemed to pulse with a faint light, but their meaning was still unclear. She moved cautiously toward one of the panels on the far side of the room. As she approached, her hand brushed against the panel, and the entire room shifted. The walls seemed to hum louder, the air growing thick with an almost electric energy. The room wasn't just a room. It was something more. It was part of the ship's core, its power source, and Alina had just activated something. A sudden shockwave of power surged through her body, and for a moment, she felt as if the ship itself had come alive. The lights flickered, and the hum of the ship intensified, filling the air with an almost deafening roar. But then, just as quickly as it began, everything stopped. The lights returned to normal, the room falling silent once more. Alina blinked, disoriented. What had just happened? She didn't have time to ponder it. The door behind her suddenly slid open, and a figure stepped into the room. The sight of him made her freeze in shock. It was the leader of the alien soldiers, the one who had tortured her, the one who had seemed invincible. But now, his posture was stiff, his face pale, his eyes wide with something she hadn't expected. Fear. "What did you do?" he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Alina took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching for the alien weapon she had stolen earlier. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she knew this was no time to be caught off guard. The alien leader's face twisted in a mixture of confusion and disbelief. You activated the core. The ship is changing." He shook his head in disbelief. "It's impossible. You're just a human." Alina didn't understand. She had no idea what he was talking about, but the fear in his voice was enough to send a chill down her spine. The ship was changing. What had she unleashed? She didn't have the luxury of finding out. Before she could react, the alien leader lunged at her, but Alina was faster. She raised the weapon, her hand steady, and fired. The blast hit him square in the chest, sending him crashing backward into the doorframe. He collapsed to the floor, his eyes wide with shock. Alina's heart hammered in her chest as she stood over him, breathing heavily. It had happened so fast. She had taken control, even if just for a moment. But what had she unleashed by activating the core? She didn't have time to think about that now. The soldiers were still coming. They would be here any second. Alina stepped over the fallen leader, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of escape. The panel she had activated earlier, what had it done? The ship began to hum again, louder this time, vibrating beneath her feet. The lights flickered once more, and a low, rumbling sound echoed throughout the walls. Alina's stomach twisted with a strange mix of dread and anticipation. Something big was happening. Something she couldn't control. Her only choice now was to run. Whatever she had set into motion, it was out of her hands. She wasn't sure if she was freeing herself or if she was about to make things worse. But she knew one thing for certain: there was no going back. As the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, Alina bolted toward the far side of the room, praying for another escape, another chance. Whatever lay ahead, she was ready. She had to be.